Beruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Chof Dalid Amid Beis, starting with Chof Dalid Amid Aleph, 5 lines from the bottom. The Gemara continues to speak about a karpef. Again, a karpef midi araisa, no matter how large it encircles, so long as you have mechitzos around it, it's a reshus hayochid. However, the Chacham said if it's beyond 2 saw, that means that the mechitzos surround an area beyond 5,000 squared amos, then you cannot metalta beyond daled amos. It has a din of a karmelis. However, if it's a karpef that's made for residential purposes, then there's no limitation, even beyond 2 saw. Our Gemara stated earlier that if one planted the majority of that area that's beyond 2 saw, then he transforms the status of being a karpef for residential purposes to now a karpef for non-residential purposes. And therefore, again, it has its limitation that you cannot carry within it beyond daled amos. But that's if you plant it as a garden. If you plant it by planting trees, it doesn't disturb the status as a residential area. And therefore, even beyond 2 saw, you can go ahead and carry it as much as you would want to metalta within that area. Says the Gemara, Karpef yoisemi beis sosayim shohukaf lediro v'nismale mayim. If you have a karpef beyond 2 saw and it was made for residential purposes, so we see that you can go ahead and metalta within it, but now it gets filled with water. Says the Gemara, what's the din? What's the status when that water fills up this area of a karpef that was made for residential purposes? Does it change the status to be a non-residential area, or it remains a residential area? Says the Gemara, Sover Rabbanu l'meimar kizroim damu v'osir. The Rabbanu thought to say that it has the same status of a person planted a garden, whereby it will then change the status to be non-residential. And therefore, you can only metalta within daled amos. It's a karmelis. Omarlu Rav Avo Avu de Rav Brei de Rav Mesharshiya. Hochi Amrina Mishmei de Rav. This is what they said in the name of Rava. Mayim kinetoim dami v'shoi. The Rav Rava stated that if water fills up this area, it has the status of a person who planted trees, and therefore remains a residential area, does not disturb its status. We're on top of Chof Daled Amud Beis. The Gemara goes on to say, Omar Ameimar v'hu dechazyon l'tashmishto, aval loy chazyon tashmito loy. Ameimar qualifies and says, so long as this water is chazi, it's fitting to be drinking, to drink, then it's going to be a status of residential, because there's no greater necessity for people who live than to then drink, and therefore it will remain a status of residential, providing that that water is for drinking. Omar Rav Ashi udechazin tashmishto nami lo yamron ela she'ein ba'umkoi yosem mibeis osayim aval im yesh ba'umkoi yosem mibeis osayim osur. Here we have Rav Ashi that further qualifies it and says that which we just said, that it has to be water that's for drinking purposes, that is further qualified provided the water is not deeper than 10 tfachim. But if it has a depth of 10 tfachim, then it then changes the status to be a non-residential karpef. And again, it's a karmelis. The Gemara says, V'lav milsihi, but this is not so. Midi dahava akarya de peri. Just like when it comes to fruit, if you have a pile of fruit in an area of the karpef that is 10 tfachim high, it doesn't change the status of being a non-residential karpef. Similarly, if you dug a trench and you put 10 tfachim in the ground of fruit, again, it remains a status of residential area. So too when it comes to the mayim, it doesn't make a difference that there's a depth of 10 tfachim, it still remains a status for residential purposes. Says the Gemara, Vaiter hahi rechava dahavoi bepum naharo. There was a rechava. Again, a rechava is the area behind the house, is normally used for storing, for non-residential purposes. And we're talking about a rechava over here that was beyond 2 saw. And this rechava was in a place called Pum Naharo. And the people of Pum Nahara, they wanted to ultimately then use this area subsequently for residential purposes, even though initially it was not made for residential purposes. And we learned before that you can't just go ahead and now pick a Pesach behind the door and then transform it into a residential area. You have to then break down a wall beyond 10 amos in order to then change the status and then rebuild it to make it so that it's going to be Pesach v'achar kach, a wall. Says the Gemara, what is the status? What happens? Dechad giso hava pasich lemata. In this rechava, on one side, it was opened up with a mavui to the town. The end, meaning the entrance of the mavui from the town, when the Rishon Rabbim had a tzuras ha-pesach. Then it goes into the rechava, and on the other side of the rechava has a shvil. It had a path of a kromim, of a vineyard, going from the other side. And it completed itself, it ended into a river bank, which was asar tfachim, the size of a wall. So what we have over here is the rechava really is enclosed. It goes from the beginning of the Rishus HaRabim, has a mavui, then has a tzuras HaPesach at the entrance that leads into this rechava. The rechava itself on the other side has a shvil that goes into a river bank, which is asar tfachim. So the entire area is closed. Normally, it would be Rishus HaYachid, you can go ahead and carry throughout the entire area. But since over here the rechava has a din of a karmelis, not only is it prohibited to go beyond Dalet Amos in the rechava, but even on the other areas that are open to it, namely the mavui, as well as the shvil, since they are open entirely to the rechava, you cannot carry within those beyond Dalet Amos. So we need to find an eitzah. How can one then transform the rechava from a non-residential area to a residential area to enable us to then carry within this area as well? Says the Gemara, La'avid Omar Baye, Hechi Navi, what can we do to then transform again the rechava to enable us to carry within it? La'avid le'mechitza agudo de nahara ein oisin mechitza al gabi mechitza. To make a mechitza on the aguda, on the river bank, so that what would that do? That would make it so that you would now have the area of the rechava and the shvil, which is really one area. You would have then a wall that would enclose, that would make it so that you have a proper enclosed area of the two, and thereby you can go ahead and metaltel within that area. But that's not a possibility, says Abaye, because then you're really just adding on to the size of the riverbank. We already have a riverbank of asar tfachim, and therefore by making a wall, it's like just adding on to that pre-existing wall. So therefore that's not a possibility. Says Abaye, if you make a tzuras ha-pesach at the mouth of the shvil that leaves the rechava, so that also is not going to be a possibility, because that tzuras ha-pesach will get destroyed through the camels, since it's a narrow pathway. Elo Omar Abaye, rather Abaye said, Le'avi lechi apischa de shvil shel kromim. Rather you should make a lechi at the entranceway to the pathway of the kromim. By making a lechi, that will then enclose the shvil. And then agav, the fact that it encloses the shvil, which would enable then the shvil to have a din of a b'shus hayachid, then you would now have an enclosed area for the rechava, which now makes it so that it's for residential purposes. Says Abaye, le'avid lechi apischa de shvil shekromim, de migo de mahanyo de shvil shekromim, mahaninami la rechava. Once you made again the lechi to enclose the shvil, so then agav migu, since you now have that to be helping to enclose the shvil, you can now use that as the way of then being mesake in the rechava for a residential purpose, and you can go ahead and metaltel in that as well. Omar le Rav said that's a problem. If you learn like that, if you permit a lechi to then misake in this area, so over here it's valid because you have a mavui that's sasum. It's closed on three sides. You have the mavui walls as well as the riverbank, which is asar tfachim. So you can put the lechi, and that will then misakein this shvil. But in the case when there is no riverbank, it'll be a mavui that's pasuach, and then by putting a lechi, it would be problematic, and people will then make a mistake that you can go ahead and put a lechi on such a shvil that's opened on two sides, that doesn't have a third enclosement. So therefore, says the Gemara, says Rava, that's not a possibility. Again, in Ken Yomu Lechi Moyil Lishvil Shakroim de Alma. They would say that lechi will work to permit to mesakein a regular shvil. Elo Amar Rava, rather Rava says, what is the way to then mesakein the rechava? As follows: Avdina le'lechi lepischa demato, on the other entrance, the area of the mavui that goes into the town, you should then go ahead and mesakein that with a lechi, because we said that the mavui that enters from the Reshus HaRabim has already a Tzuras HaPesach. So then the other side of the mavui that goes into the rechava, if you put a lechi, that will mesakein the mavui. And at the same time, they'll also then mesakein the rechava to be a rechava now as a rechava for residential purposes. As follows: Demigu de mahani lechi lemato, mahani nami lerechava. Just like since you now made a lechi for the mavui that goes from the town, that will mesakein that mavui, so too you can go ahead and then that will aga, that will migu, since that will then work for the mavui, that will also then work to change the status of the rechava to be a residential rechava. Now Rava doesn't have the same problem that he had when he then asked on Abai, because Abai was talking about a situation where you had a riverbank. That's not an obvious wall. So then Rav was concerned people will then make a mistake. But over here, when you have a clear Tziras HaPesach on the one side, on the other side you can make a lechi, people will not make a mistake and think that a mavi mefulash, you can also just put a lechi. Hilkach, says the Gemara, tiltu lebemato gufo shori. Tiltu leberachava gufe shori. Therefore, says the Gemara, to metaltil in the mato alone, that means in the mavui, certainly you can do that. To metaltil also in the rechava, you can also do that. But the question is, what about going from one to the other? Memata lerechava, merechava lemato, pligi barav achva ravino. It's a machlekes. Whether you can go from the rechava to the mata, that means to the mavui, or vice versa. Chad aser v'chad shoi. One says it's mutter, the other one says it's aser. On top of Chof Hey Amid Aleph, man deshori daha lekediurin. The one that is matir says the reason why it's mutter is because we have no people who live in the rechava, and therefore, if people lived in the rechava, then you'd have to combine the rechava and the mavui with an eruv. But now that nobody lives in the rechava, there's no concern to make an eruv, and therefore you can go ahead and walk and metalta from one to the next, and vice versa. Uman de oser zimnin dehave badiurin v'oser tiltuli. But the one that says it's oser is concerned that granted right now there's nobody who lives in the rechava, but maybe subsequently people will then begin living in the rechava, and therefore that will then cause it to be prohibited without an eruv, and they'll continue to go ahead and metalta one from the next. So therefore he says it's oser even now.